The Handmaid's Tale. In 1985, Margaret Atwood published a dystopian novel that would become one of the most challenged books in American schools and trigger sustained, coordinated campaigns for its removal that would span decades and multiple continents and regions. The Handmaid's Tale depicted a nightmarish theocratic future where women were systematically stripped of all rights, their bodies controlled by the authoritarian state for reproductive purposes, and the narrative contained unflinching discussions of feminism, religious extremism, patriarchy, and human sexuality, in ways that made it deeply uncomfortable for certain conservative lawmakers and organized parent groups who viewed the book's worldview as inherently hostile to their religious and traditional values. The book ended up on Texas's extensive list of banned materials, with schools throughout the state citing profanity and supposedly anti-Christian sentiment as justification for removal. While similar challenges emerged in Tennessee, Florida, Utah, Pennsylvania, and other states pursuing increasingly aggressive and systematic book removal policies. By 2024, the American Library Association had tracked multiple coordinated removal attempts across school districts, making The Handmaid's Tale one of the most frequently challenged works in contemporary American schools and libraries. But something remarkable happened in the midst of this sustained and organized assault. The book refused to disappear into obscurity. Across courts and school districts and library systems, networks of readers and librarians and educators fought back with organized, persistent, and legally grounded resistance. In 2023, when South Carolina parents and state legislators specifically called for its removal from school libraries in response to abortion policy debates, the challenge failed spectacularly despite organized effort. The book remained on shelves. Liberties organizations, including the ACLU, filed detailed legal briefs challenging the removal. Teachers testified publicly about its educational value in literature and history courses. Academic scholars published articles defending its literary merit and its relevance to understanding how totalitarianism emerges and takes hold. Atwood herself became an unlikely but powerful activist, transforming from celebrated literary author into public defender of intellectual freedom, auctioning off an unburnable special copy of the novel in 2022, with all proceeds benefiting PEN America, a freedom of expression nonprofit dedicated to protecting writers and freedom of expression worldwide. The irony was almost too perfect, almost poetic in its philosophical precision. Here was a book fundamentally about censorship, about the systematic erasure of ideas and voices and the totalitarian control of women's bodies, being challenged and attacked by those who claimed to represent moral authority and traditional conservative values. Yet despite coordinated efforts across multiple states, despite sophisticated legal arguments about age appropriateness and parental rights, despite political campaigns organized specifically to target this single novel, the book's legal and cultural status held firm and strong. Publishers continued printing new editions in multiple formats. Teachers continued assigning it in advanced placement and honors literature courses nationwide. Students continued reading it, discovering in its pages echoes of their own fears and anxieties about the future. By attempting to ban The Handmaid's Tale, lawmakers had inadvertently drawn global attention to exactly the kind of dystopian control and censorship Atwood had imagined. Gender queer. Maya Kobabe's illustrated memoir became the single most challenged book in contemporary America, facing an astonishing 151 different removal attempts in a single year, far exceeding the challenges faced by any other work in American literary history and demonstrating organized, coordinated censorship efforts. Released in 2019, Genderqueer tells the deeply personal and intimate story of Kobabe's exploration of gender identity and self-discovery through a carefully crafted combination of written narrative and graphic novel illustrations, creating a visual and textual representation of non-binary experience that resonated with profound intensity among young readers struggling with their own identity questions and desperately seeking validation and visibility in mainstream literature. The illustrated format proved particularly threatening to conservative censorship advocates who viewed the combination of written and visual content as more persuasive and potentially more psychologically corrupting than text alone could ever be. The combination of explicitly LGBTQ plus themes with visual depictions of gender expression and embodiment created what advocates for removal saw as a perfect storm requiring immediate action and organized removal campaigns. Schools across Idaho, Virginia, Missouri, North Carolina, California, and multiple other states moved systematically to pull the book from shelves, often citing identical arguments and demonstrating what appeared to be coordinated strategic efforts. In 2024, the Ada Community Library in Idaho removed it under intense pressure from organized community groups and parent organizations. A school superintendent in Virginia unilaterally removed it from the high school library without following proper challenge procedures that district policy required, a decision he later admitted violated the district's own established policies for book challenges. Other removals followed quietly, in small districts with fewer resources and institutional support, to defend against well-organized removal campaigns funded by national organizations. Yet despite these coordinated and systematic attacks across multiple states, the book remained published and continuously printed, remained actively defended by the American Civil Liberties Union and other powerful civil liberties organizations, and continued to reach the readers it was written for through alternative channels, online communities, and libraries willing to resist removal pressure. Courts consistently refused to sustain removals based purely on LGBTQ+ content or gender identity themes. The American Library Association, the Authors Guild, and PEN America mounted vigorous and strategic defenses, filing detailed briefs in litigation and making strong public statements about the book's cultural and educational importance. Kobabe and other published authors testified publicly about the book's legitimacy as autobiographical literature worthy of full protection under First Amendment principles. Publishers kept printing new copies in various editions, sometimes in larger print runs to meet demand created by the publicity surrounding challenges and removal attempts. Independent bookstores promoted it prominently, sometimes creating special displays dedicated to challenged books and censorship resistance. Online communities shared reading lists featuring genderqueer and supported readers seeking copies and information. What lawmakers and organized removal campaigns attempted as erasure became, paradoxically, a powerful rallying point that unified defenders of intellectual freedom across the nation. The very efforts to suppress the book brought it wider recognition and deeper cultural resonance, transforming it from a successful young adult memoir into a symbol of resistance to censorship and a touchstone for intellectual freedom debates. Kobabe's memoir survived not because it lacked controversy or because it avoided difficult topics, but because the institutions defending intellectual freedom proved substantially more powerful and better resourced than those seeking to erase it. Maus, Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel about the Holocaust, represents a particularly disturbing and alarming category of book bans, one where even historically significant, critically acclaimed, and internationally celebrated works became targets of systematic removal efforts and organized campaigns. Published initially in 1980 and then in a completed 2-volume edition in 1991, Maus tells the intricate and emotionally complex true story of how Spiegelman interviewed his aging father about his harrowing experiences surviving the Holocaust, with Jews depicted as mice and Nazis as cats, a visual metaphor that invokes and directly confronts Hitler's own dehumanizing language of Jews as vermin and subhuman creatures. The graphic novel is brutal and unsparing in its complete honesty, depicting not just the historical horrors and systematic genocide, but also Spiegelman's complicated relationship with his deeply traumatized father and his lifelong struggle to process transgenerational trauma and inherited psychological pain. The work had become foundational to Holocaust education globally and was widely taught in schools as both a testament to human survival and a powerful warning against totalitarianism and authoritarianism. In 2022, the McMinn County School Board in Tennessee voted to remove mouse from the 8th grade curriculum, citing concerns about nudity depicted in Holocaust scenes and allegedly offensive language. Though critics noted these technical concerns seemed transparently pretextual, given the work's profound historical and educational significance. The removal sparked immediate and nationwide outrage from educators, survivors, and readers. Holocaust educators and survivors expressed profound horror and disbelief that such a foundational text of Holocaust remembrance and Holocaust education could be pulled from school curriculum, fearing that removing mouse would contribute to Holocaust denial, historical amnesia, and forgetting. Spiegelman himself spoke publicly about the removal, noting with shy R.I.P. irony. The philosophical and moral bankruptcy of using Nazi imagery contained in his explicitly anti-Nazi work as justification for banning the book from young readers. The American Library Association defended the book strongly and loudly through public statements and legal action. Bookstores across the country reported dramatically increased sales following the controversy, with Maus climbing bestseller lists as consumers purchased copies in direct solidarity with the author and against censorship. Publishers released special anniversary editions and created promotional materials. Universities created expanded reading lists, highlighting the book's importance. Legal scholars wrote extensively about the First Amendment violations implicit in the removal. Within months, the removal faced such sustained opposition and powerful public backlash that administrators began quietly backtracking, facing enormous and coordinated pressure from teachers, parents, librarians, and community members who had mobilized effectively in defense of the work. Though the immediate ban technically stood in that particular district, the national backlash was so severe and so sustained that Maus actually became unavailable to fewer students nationwide than before the controversy, as other schools and libraries proactively protected and prominently promoted the book. The attempted suppression, ironically and paradoxically, transformed Maus from a widely respected but primarily academic text into a contemporary symbol of institutional resistance to censorship and a powerful rallying point for those defending intellectual freedom and freedom to read. Annie on My Mind. In Kansas, a school board voted to remove Annie on My Mind from secondary school libraries, citing technical concerns about its depiction of a romantic relationship between two teenage girls and arguments about age appropriateness and sexual content that many viewed as transparent pretext for ideological suppression. Published in 1982, Nancy Garden's novel broke significant and progressive new ground by portraying a genuine, emotionally authentic relationship between lesbian characters, treating their love with the same seriousness, tenderness, and respect afforded to heterosexual relationships in mainstream young adult literature and romantic narratives. For countless LGBTQ+ youth struggling with their identities and searching for representation, the book represented the first time they encountered stories that reflected their own lives, their own desires, their own sense of possibility and human connection and acceptance. The removal attempt triggered a legal court challenge by students and library advocates who argued powerfully and effectively that the school board's decision was motivated by ideological disagreement with the book's LGBTQ+ themes and representation, rather than by legitimate educational concerns or genuine worries about content appropriateness and student safety. The court examined the evidence presented carefully and agreed decisively with the challenger's arguments. Judges found that the school board's actual motivation was clear disapproval of the ideas expressed in the book and disapproval of the lesbian relationships depicted, and that this ideological motivation violated the First Amendment's fundamental protection of diverse viewpoints and diverse voices in educational settings. The ruling became groundbreaking and influential far beyond Kansas's borders. Years before the contemporary wave of LGBTQ+ focused book bans and organized challenges that would emerge in the 21st century, this Kansas case established foundational legal principle that courts would not tolerate removals based on sexual orientation or the mere presence of LGBTQ+ characters and relationships in literature. The decision created powerful legal precedent that subsequent challenges to LGBTQ+ literature would cite repeatedly in courtrooms across the nation in later decades. Annie on My Mind remained in circulation and continues to circulate and be published today. It continued to be published in new editions and formats, continued to reach young readers who desperately needed its message, and continued to serve as a powerful legal and cultural landmark for First Amendment protections in educational libraries. Slaughterhouse-Five. Kurt Vonnegut's anti-war masterpiece became a target for systematic removal in the Island Trees School District in New York, where the school board voted to pull it from library shelves along with other titles they deemed anti-American, anti-Christian, and obscene in ways they believed threatened community values and proper moral development. Published in 1969, Slaughterhouse-Five is a semi-autobiographical novel based on Vonnegut's own traumatic experiences as a prisoner of war during the catastrophic and devastating firebombing of Dresden in World War II, an event that killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night and haunted Vonnegut psychologically for his entire life. The book combines science fiction and time travel elements with unflinching and brutal depictions of war's absolute senselessness and human devastation, including scenes of graphic violence, sexual assault, and abundant profanity that rendered it controversial and deeply objectionable in conservative and religious communities concerned about vulgarity and moral corruption of youth. The removal attempt in Island Trees triggered what would become a landmark and historically significant Supreme Court case, Board of Education, Island Trees Union Free School District No. 26 v. Pico, decided in 1982 in a decision that would reshape and define legal protections for intellectual freedom in library settings. Though there was no single clear majority opinion commanding unanimous agreement from all the justices, the Supreme Court held firmly and decisively that the First Amendment limits and constrains the ability of school boards to remove books from library shelves simply because board members disagree with the content or ideas in those books. The justices agreed substantially that school libraries serve a vitally important role in disseminating diverse information and diverse ideas to young people, and that officials cannot remove books purely because they personally dislike the ideas contained within them or find those ideas offensive and disagreeable. The decision established clearly and authoritatively that legitimate reasons for removal must exist, such as pervasive vulgarity or genuine lack of educational suitability, rather than mere ideological disagreement or political opposition to particular viewpoints and perspectives. Slaughterhouse-Five was restored to Island Trees shelves by direct order of the court. The case created powerful and influential precedent that would be invoked repeatedly in subsequent challenges to book removal and censorship efforts across the nation. The novel remains a staple of high school and college curricula across America and continues to reach new generations of students, confronting questions of war, morality, trauma, and the meaning of human suffering. The Best Short Stories by Negro Writers. Also challenged in Island Trees alongside Slaughterhouse-Five, this groundbreaking and historically important anthology, compiled by the legendary poet and writer Langston Hughes, faced systematic removal efforts based on claims that it was fundamentally anti-American and inappropriate for young readers to encounter. The collection served to celebrate and elevate African-American literary achievement and contribution during a period when Black voices, Black perspectives, and Black artistic contributions were systematically excluded and marginalized from mainstream educational canons and school curricula. The 1982 Supreme Court decision in the Island Trees case protected not just Vonnegut's novel, but this anthology as well, extending First Amendment protections to works celebrating Black literature, Black history, and Black culture. The removal of The Best Short Stories by Negro Writers was found by the court to violate students' fundamental First Amendment rights to access diverse perspectives and diverse literary traditions, reflecting the full breadth and richness of American culture and human experience. The decision affirmed emphatically and definitively that school boards could not remove anthologies celebrating Black authors and Black experiences and Black cultural perspectives simply because board members disagreed with the cultural viewpoints and social perspectives presented in those important works. The collection remained available in school libraries and in bookstores and libraries nationwide. Students continued to encounter the powerful, authentic voices of Black writers in educational settings and classrooms. The Supreme Court precedent established and clarified meant that future attempts to remove literature celebrating marginalized communities and minority cultures would face significant constitutional obstacles and legal challenges, providing important protection for diverse voices in library collections and educational materials. Harry Potter series. When a parent in a Missouri school district objected strenuously to the Harry Potter books, claiming they encouraged childhood disobedience and involved witchcraft and the occult in ways that violated conservative religious teachings, the school board voted to restrict access by shelving them out of view on upper shelves and requiring explicit parental permission slips to check them out from library collections. The Harry Potter series, written by J.K. Rowling, had become the most widely read and beloved children's book series in America, generating massive commercial sales, cultural phenomenon status, and long waiting lists of eager students wanting to borrow copies from school libraries. The restriction seemed transparently and obviously designed to limit young readers' access based on ideological and religious objections to the magical content and the secular worldview presented in the books. The parents' actions and the civil liberties organizations supporting students challenged the restriction in court, arguing forcefully that it violated First Amendment protections for intellectual freedom in schools and public educational institutions. The court examined the evidence presented carefully and found that there was no credible evidence that students would face any genuine disruption or actual harm if allowed unfettered and unrestricted access to the books. More importantly, the judges ruled decisively and clearly that restricting access based on ideological disagreement with the ideas and content expressed within the books violated the First Amendment's core and fundamental protections. The decision established clear legal principle that restrictions motivated by disagreement with content or ideas violate constitutional protections, even when applied to popular fiction aimed at children and young readers. The Harry Potter books were restored to unrestricted shelves at the appropriate reading level, where students could access them freely and without barriers. The series continued its meteoric and unprecedented rise in popularity and cultural influence in American schools. Students who had faced arbitrary restricted access to the books could now check them out freely and without shame, without parental permission forms, without any explanation or justification. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Maya Angelou's transformative and deeply beloved memoir, widely taught and celebrated in schools across America as a foundational and essential text in African American literature and human resilience, became caught in federal censorship efforts when the Department of Defense Education Activity issued explicit directives removing it from military academies and Department of Defense schools worldwide. The memoir, which chronicles Angelou's profound personal journey from childhood trauma, racism, and self-imposed selective muteness to finding her authentic voice through literature, writing, performance, and courageous self-discovery, contains unflinching and necessary discussions of racism, sexual assault, poverty, and the Black experience in Jim Crow America. The removal came under executive orders directing military educators to systematically eliminate books dealing with race, racism, systemic inequality, and other topics deemed divisive or critical of American history and institutions. Yet the attempt to suppress Angelou's transformative and important work encountered immediate and forceful resistance from communities and institutions powerfully committed to intellectual freedom and diversity. Teachers and librarians protested vociferously and publicly. Civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and others, filed legal briefs and made strong public statements opposing the removal. Publishers mobilized substantial resources in defense of the work. The removal, while technically enacted initially in military educational settings, sparked such widespread opposition and public outcry that it became politically and culturally untenable to maintain. The cultural backlash against removing one of America's most celebrated and deeply revered autobiographies proved too significant and too powerful for the federal censorship effort to sustain against coordinated institutional resistance. Angelo's memoir was restored to military school libraries and made fully available. Its author's powerful legacy was protected and promoted nationwide. Students in military education settings and in public schools across the nation continued to encounter her transformative voice and powerful testimony about resilience. The Bluest Eye, Toni Morrison's powerful and unflinching debut novel, depicting the devastating experiences of a young black girl named Pecola in 1940s. Ohio, struggling to navigate systemic racism, sexual abuse, and deeply internalized beauty standards that privilege whiteness and European features, became a specific target for systematic removal in multiple school districts across conservative regions nationwide. Published in 1970, the novel was both celebrated and praised by literary critics who recognized its extraordinary artistic brilliance and innovative narrative structure, and attacked fiercely by those who objected to its unflinching and honest portrayal of racism and sexual violence against vulnerable and marginalized black children. The book faced coordinated removal challenges in Texas and other conservative states, with opponents citing sexual content, disturbing psychological themes, and what they viewed as depressing and supposedly inappropriate content for young readers. Yet each and every challenge ultimately failed in court or through sustained community resistance and defense. Courts consistently recognized the novel's profound literary significance and its undeniable importance for understanding African American historical experience and the devastating impact of systemic racism and colonized beauty standards imposed through white supremacy. Teachers across the nation testified passionately about how Morrison's groundbreaking work opened students' eyes to systemic injustice and racial oppression and white supremacy. Literary scholars emphasized its essential canonical importance to American literature and cultural understanding. Publishers and the Authors Guild defended it vigorously through detailed legal briefs and sustained public advocacy. The novel remained in print through multiple editions, remained widely taught in high schools and colleges, remained available to students who desperately needed to encounter its difficult and necessary truth about American racism. All Boys Aren't Blue, George M. Johnson's powerful and honest young adult memoir, a collection of interconnected essays about growing up black and queer in America, specifically in New Jersey and the South, became a flashpoint for contemporary removal challenges and coordinated censorship campaigns. The book addresses with unflinching honesty racism, homophobia, internalized oppression, sexual assault, trauma, and the author's personal journey to self-acceptance and authentic living as a black queer man. Multiple school districts and library systems attempted to remove it from shelves, citing sexual content, LGBTQ+ themes, and discussions of sexuality that critics claimed were inappropriate for young readers. Each removal attempt faced swift legal challenge from civil liberties advocates. Civil liberties organizations, including the ACLU, intervened and filed motions. The Authors Guild filed detailed briefs defending the book's literary merit and importance. Parents who supported the book's presence in school libraries testified alongside educators and librarians about its profound importance for LGBTQ+ youth of color, and all students who needed to encounter authentic narratives reflecting diverse lived experiences. The sustained defense network that had emerged over decades to protect intellectual freedom in libraries proved effective and powerful. The book remained in circulation and continued to be printed in new editions. Johnson continued writing and speaking publicly about LGBTQ+ experiences and the importance of representation. Students continued discovering their own experiences reflected and validated in his essays, finding in his work permission to be their authentic selves. These 10 books survived systematic removal attempts, not because they lacked controversy or presented uncontroversial material, and certainly not because those seeking to suppress them lacked power, resources, or determination to silence them. Rather, they survived because extensive networks of resistance emerged and mobilized strategically to defend them against coordinated suppression efforts. Libraries and librarians across the nation refused quietly to enforce removals or actively allowed removed books to be restored to circulation. Teachers testified publicly and forcefully about the educational value and literary merit of contested works. Civil rights organizations and freedom of expression groups filed detailed legal briefs challenging removals before courts. Publishers mobilized substantial legal and financial resources to defend their authors and editorial choices. The Authors Guild defended the professional interests and creative freedom of writers facing censorship. Courts invoked and actively strengthened First Amendment protections for intellectual freedom. Communities of readers shared reading lists and created study groups and reading circles for mutual support. The pattern across these 10 cases reveals something crucial and essential about how intellectual freedom persists and can prevail even under sustained and organized assault from well-funded censorship campaigns. When a single book is challenged in isolation, it might disappear quietly from library shelves, pulled by cautious administrators seeking to avoid conflict and community division. But when multiple books are challenged systematically and strategically, when organized efforts reveal their coordinated nature and shared ideological motivation, resistance networks activate and mobilize in response. The legal precedents created by the landmark Island Trees case in 1982 shaped defenses of all subsequent books and challenges, providing constitutional framework for resistance and legal protection. The First Amendment protections established and strengthened through decades of litigation created formidable and lasting obstacles to easy and unchallenged censorship. The cultural investments made by publishers, authors, and educators meant that books became powerful symbols worth defending, worth fighting for, worth protecting through legal and cultural means. What would have been erasure and historical forgetting in an earlier era became instead catalyst for mobilizing far broader coalitions of educators, librarians, authors, and passionate community members. From Margaret Atwood's theatrical and symbolic auction of an unburnable copy of The Handmaid's Tale to teachers' passionate public testimony about why genderqueer and all boys aren't blue matter to their students' development, the attempted erasure of these books generated conversations that amplified their reach and cultural impact rather than constraining it. The 10 books documented here represent not isolated and disconnected victories, but integral pieces of a larger and ongoing story about how institutional and cultural resistance can frustrate and ultimately defeat coordinated censorship efforts. Slaughterhouse-Five and the Best Short Stories by Negro writers might have vanished completely from school libraries, if not for the Supreme Court's decisive intervention in Island Trees. The Harry Potter series might have remained restricted and limited if the court had accepted purely ideological objections as sufficient grounds for access restrictions. The Bluest Eye and All Boys Aren't Blue might have been quietly and completely removed from libraries if civil rights organizations and LGBTQ+ advocates had not mobilized and fought back effectively. Yet these books survived because enough people, in enough places, across enough institutions and communities, chose deliberately and courageously to defend their presence and their importance. The future of intellectual freedom in libraries and schools depends fundamentally on whether those networks of resistance can continue to function and grow as organized censorship efforts themselves grow more sophisticated, better funded, more strategic, and more coordinated across state lines and regional boundaries. These 10 cases prove conclusively that such resistance is possible. They also prove, undeniably, how much ongoing vigilance and commitment is required to protect the freedom to read.